Hey friends, I'm so excited to be sharing the process of how I created these cards using the new Holtz Uncharted Mariner Distress Color. In this video, I'm sharing a card I created using the Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide and the stamp and smudge technique. I've combined it with some other distress colors to create a nautical themed card. I've also mixed together a variety of techniques and products to help carry out the theme. And for even more inspiration, I have two other cards I created using this gorgeous new color over on my blog. So make sure to head over there to check them out using the link in my description. I know what you're thinking, another blue. There are so many blues already. Well, the answer is yes. Yes to another blue, and yes, you need to add Uncharted Mariner to your collection. Before I get into sharing the project I created, I wanted to do a quick swatch comparison of the blues that I thought this color was the same as, and why I wouldn't need this color. I thought for sure that it was close to faded jeans, broken china, or even peacock feathers. As you can see, it's not even close. Maybe kind of to broken china, but it's a much darker, moodier color than that, and it's a perfect color to pair with this one if you're wanting a slight color gradient. If these few colors don't answer your concerns, I also swatched all of the blues and blue-greens in the Distress line for a comparison. If you need even more swatch comparisons, make sure to check out Tim's YouTube Live. Now that you've seen the swatches, let's get on to the making. When I'm creating a card, I usually start with the background. This card was no exception. I had already decided on a nautical theme, inspired by the new color of course, and had found this photo in my stash of Idea-ology that I knew I wanted to use. I also knew I wanted to use the stamp and smudge technique using Distress Oxide ink. If you aren't familiar with this technique, I'll be showing you how I do it in this video. I began with a piece of Distress Heavy Stock paper cut to 4 by 5 1/4 inches. This paper is perfect for this technique since you aren't going to be adding any water. I adhered it down inside my stamp positioning tool using some repositionable adhesive. The stamp sets I'm using on this card are the Holtz Sea Life and Eccentric stamp sets. The Distress Oxide colors I'm using are Uncharted Mariner, Cracked Pistachio, and Abandoned Coral. Prior to filming, I had spent some time figuring out where I wanted to place each stamp and what ink and stamp color I wanted to use on a scrap piece of paper. I'm using this as a template for where to place each stamp and what color to use. I've found doing it this way to be really helpful in figuring out the stamp and color placement and creating a balanced looking design. Typically, I try to place the same colored images in a visual triangle, which helps to keep your eye moving across the design. The stamp and smudge technique is pretty simple. You stamp the image using Distress Oxide ink and then smudge the ink using a paper towel or rag. Oxide ink is the best type of ink to use for this technique because it has a slower drying time, which gives you time to smudge it before it dries. This technique won't work with regular Distress ink because it dries too fast. As I stamp the various images, you may notice me dabbing at them with a paper towel before I smudge the ink. I'm doing this to remove some of the ink, especially on the images that have a more bold design. If you smudge the ink with all that ink on it, it tends to smear the ink too much and you will lose a lot of the image's detail. For more detailed images with thinner lines, you don't need to worry about doing this. With the stamping and smudging completed, I added a bit more stamping using some images from the Eccentric stamp set and frayed burlap archival ink. For one final bit of stamping, I used the Bubbles stamp with Pumice Stone Distress Oxide ink and added it to the upper right and bottom left-hand corners for a bit more texture. After I had finished the background, I moved on to the focal point, the little sailor photo. I knew I wanted to create some layers to place behind it, and I thought it would be fun to create a porthole. To create the porthole, I used scrapbook.com mint tape to hold 2 circle dies in place on a piece of silver metallic craft stock. I ran this through my die cutting machine. I then repeated this process with 2 pieces of Distress heavy stock. I later glued these circles together to give the piece more dimension. Taking the silver metallic craft stock, I applied a thin layer of Distress grit paste to the piece using a palette knife and then set it to the side to dry. While the grit paste was drying, I worked on the other layer to go behind the photo. This was created by die cutting a piece of Distress watercolor paper using a die from the Labels Thinlits die set. After cutting it, I smushed the paper into some old paper Distress ink that I had placed on my craft mat and spritzed with a little bit of water. I then dried it with my heat tool. This technique adds a nice distressed effect to the paper, and the inking and smushing can be repeated as needed to get the desired look. Next, I applied brushed corduroy Distress ink to a script stamp and stamped it onto the die cut. I then spritzed the piece with water using my Distress sprayer, dabbed it with a paper towel to lift off some of the ink, and then dried it with my heat tool. I finished it off by inking the edges with brushed corduroy Distress ink. The sentiment strip is from the Noteworthy stamp set and was stamped in Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide ink onto a piece of Distress watercolor paper that I also die cut using a die from the Labels Thinlits die set. Before die cutting the paper or stamping the sentiment, I used the same ink smushing technique I did on the other piece. I then inked the edges with brushed corduroy Distress ink. Now back to the porthole. With the grit paste dry, I began applying a mix of alcohol inks to it. I found it best to apply a little bit of alcohol ink blending solution to it first, and then to apply the inks. Doing this seemed to help the inks blend and move around easier. I also used an ink blower to help blend and move the inks around as well. The alcohol ink colors I'm using are Pitched Black, Rust, and Mushroom. I also added in a little bit of Foundry Alloy alcohol ink for touch of shimmer, but in the end I'm not sure that this was really necessary, but I had fun with the process. To finish off the porthole, I added some Idea-ology hardware heads that I grunged up. To do this, I applied a little bit of Distress Collage Medium to them, allowed it to dry, and then added some Mushroom alcohol ink. I find the collage medium adds just a touch of texture, but you could certainly skip this step if you want to save some time. Once everything was dry, I adhered them to the porthole using Distress Collage Medium. Here's a look at the completed card. I adhered the label die cut and the porthole piece to the card front using Distress Collage Medium. I also added a couple of tabs using stamps from the Eccentric stamp set with Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide. For added dimension, I adhered the photo and the sentiment strip using double-sided foam adhesive. To give the card a little more texture and to mimic fish netting, I added some mummy cloth behind the photo. I also did a little machine stitching around the outside edge. I then inked around the edges of a piece of Distress heavy stock cut to 4 1/4 by 5.5 inches with Uncharted Mariner Distress Oxide to create a color-coordinated layer to place behind the card front. And with that, my card is completed. I want to thank scrapbook.com for being so generous in sending me this gorgeous new color to create with. Thanks so much for watching. I'm truly grateful for you. I was wondering if you could do me a quick favor and subscribe to my channel or leave me a thumbs up or a comment. If you're feeling extra generous, I'd love for you to share about my channel with your friends. All of these things help out us YouTubers so much, and it would mean so much to me to have your support.